Okay, this is an interview at the Hampton Inn, Rochester, New York, the 12th of January 2004, approximately 3:30 p.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Okay. Gary Beikirch, born in Rochester, New York, August 29th, 1947.
Okay, what was your educational background prior to entering service?
Prior to going into the service, I had finished high school, decided to go to college because the girl I was going with at the time was going to college. She majored in PE, so I said I'd major in PE too. 3 months after being there, she broke up with me, so I didn't have much commitment to being in school, but I stuck it out for another 2 years, for about 2 years anyhow. And then I quit after 2 years. That was back in '67. Quit college and enlisted in the Army.
Why did you decide to enlist?
Big reason was I thought I'd make my girlfriend jealous. Then I wanted to go into Green Berets because I thought I would show her what a hunk of a man she missed, you know, what she could have had. And the other reason was that I thought there'd be a good challenge, so that's why I went in Special Forces. And then I wanted to travel. I wanted a lot of adventure. Plus also back at Brockport College in the mid-'60s, there was a hotbed of controversy. And everybody had their opinion about Vietnam, but I wanted to find out for myself what Vietnam and what this whole thing was about. I had a couple of friends from high school that had already quit college previously, and a good friend of mine, and I remember the day that he came back, he was going to University of Denver, and he quit college. His girlfriend broke up with him, and he wanted me to come back and enlist in the Marine Corps with him. And I said, no, I don't think so. I don't want to go in the Marine Corps. But he went in and became one of the youngest graduates of Marine Corps OCS, but he was killed at Quezon. I don't know, as all my motivations for initially going in were all patriotic, but there was some of that. I really felt that I wanted to find out what Vietnam was like. I felt I should do something for the country too. Plus also there was that wanting to show up my girlfriend some things too. There was all that. Plus then there was just the macho thing of wanting to prove myself.
When did you go into service?
August 31st, 1967.
Okay. So you went in with the express purpose of joining the Special Forces?
That was my goal.
That was your goal?
Yeah. I remember going down to the recruiting center, talking to Sergeant First Class Floda, was his name. And I said, I want to become a Green Beret. I literally said that. And he just said, well, it doesn't work like that. He said, you got to go in, and there's a lot of schools and tests that you have to pass. He said, but I think I can get you into airborne infantry. And then, like it was a big challenge to get into airborne infantry. But he said, I can get you into that. And then from there, you'll just have to be on your own and go get through jump school, and then they'll come down to jump school and give you tests, and if you pass those, then you have to go on. And he said, from then on, it'll be up to you, but I can get you into airborne infantry. And I said, you do that for me? And he said, sure, I do that. So I went in airborne infantry. Yeah. Pretty naive. 20-year-old naive kid.
You enlisted here in Rochester?
Yes.
Where did you go for your basic?
I did my basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey. Yeah. Right during, I did my AIT as well there. E53 was my basic training unit, Echo 5-3, and then did AIT at Fort Dix as well. Most of the guys that went in my basic training company were in the new barracks, but for the AIT, the infantry, we were in the old World War II barracks by McGuire Air Force Base, and that was cold then, and it was winter. I remember they got us over shoveling off some deserted airstrip at McGuire, telling us that we had to get this done because an emergency plane was going to make a landing, and all we had was the trenching tools. And That was some of the harassment. Didn't take us too long before we realized we were being hassled. But yeah, did basic and AIT at Fort Dix.
Okay. Where did you go from there?
From there, I went to Fort Benning, Georgia, for 3 weeks of jump school.
Can you tell us about some of your experiences?
In jump school?
Stands out?
Yeah. In jump school, well, experiences in basic training. Normally, it was my understanding that everybody had to have a KP at least once, just to experience KP. I had it 9 times in 8 weeks of basic training because I had this bad attitude. I guess I don't know what it was, but although I was told that was the kind of guy that Special Forces were looking for, I just had all kinds of trouble. I was always doing KP. And AIT was a little bit easier. But by the time I got to jump school, I was pretty gung-ho, at least. But I remember going through in our jump school company, there was about 7 of us that were hopefully going to be going to SF training. Most of the guys from AIT went to Korea out of my unit, except for those of us that were going to jump school, or OCS. But in our jump school company, there was about 7 of us from that were going to be going to SF, and there were a group of Navy SEALs that we went through jump school with, and some recon Marines, and there was always competition between us, the SEALs especially.
What kind of special tests did you have to take to get into Special Forces? You said that there was a battery of tests.
Yeah,
you alluded to that earlier.
Yeah, after about, I think it was the last week of jump school, some cadre from Fort Bragg came to Fort Benning, and they put us through if I remember correctly, there was a battery of written tests. One of them was critical decisions. They'd give you I remember it seems like I was in there all day just taking these written tests. They would give you critical decisions, and they would say, and you'd have to write down what would be your responses in these situations. Another part of the test was to judge your perspective kind of things. You'd be looking at a particular object, and then they'd say, if you're looking at this object, this is the view you're looking at. Now we'll give you a general picture of the lay of the land. Where are you in order to be able to see this object from this point of view? Point out where you are in this picture, in this general lay of the land. I have no idea what that was all about, other than just to test our reasoning abilities and things like that. All kinds of aptitude testing. Then we had to take a foreign language test. We had to take some more written expression tests, and then we had the PT test as well. I don't really remember the PT test as being all that challenging, but it must have been because some of the guys didn't pass the PT test. But those were the main things, and some of the guys that didn't pass that went to the NCO. They had just started an NCO academy. I think about 2 or 3 of the guys didn't make it, and so they went into that NCO academy. But there was about 4 of us that went to Fort Bragg after jump school. I remember in jump school was one of my, like I said, first experiences with the SEALs, and they were an impressive crew. They really were. We'd be running our 5 miles in the morning, and before we'd be about a half a mile, and we'd have to run in formation. And before we'd get about half a mile away from the end, SEALs would all break formation and sprint, the rest of the way ahead of everybody else, so that when the rest of us were coming across the line, they'd be standing there in formation, and then the TAC sergeants would go up to their lieutenant and ensign, I think they called them, whoever was in charge of them, and he would say, "Very impressive, but I want you all to drop down and give me 10. And they would always say, 1 hand or 2 hands, Sergeant. And they'd all drop and give 10 push-ups, 1-handed push-ups. I mean, they were impressive. And then the last day, everybody always tries to do some crazy stunts, and they climbed to the top of the 200-foot tower, and they tied this inflatable frog from the 200-foot tower These guys were nuts. But that's when I started really developing some real unit pride and esprit de corps, which was an important thing, because I saw the SEALs had it. And then when I first saw some of the SF guys, they instilled it in us too. So it was exciting. I was looking forward to it, really looking forward to it.
Now, did you receive specialized weapon training and so on, or was that later? Or
In AIT, my MOS was light weapons.
Mhm.
I was a light weapons specialist, so I had received training in all the light weapons right up to a 106 recoilless rifle. For all different mortars. Even though I wasn't 11 Charlie, normally people who were mortarmen got 11 Charlie, but I did receive training in mortars, 106s, and then the regular machine guns and all the different kinds of weapons. Then when we got to Special Forces, I know that the program has kind of changed now, but back then you started out with 8 weeks of what they called Special Forces basic training, where we would do a lot of land navigation, squad tactics, guerrilla operations, land navigation, ambush techniques, a lot of those things. It was eight weeks of classroom, and then harassment, and after we finished, and then there would be a 2-week FTX. And during that time, we'd get a little bit of training with weapons and communications and those kinds of things. But everybody who went through that first phase, what they called phase 1 training, all had the same basic training. It was like basic training all over again, although with Special Forces emphasis. Began to get involved with some counter-guerrilla operations, guerrilla operations, psychological stuff. And when you finished that, after the 2-week FTX, then you were awarded the beret. You could wear the beret.
Did you have a lot of people drop out of the program
Oh, yeah.
or get bounced out?
Yeah, people were leaving all the time. They would harass you. They'd wake you up like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and say, "Come on, be downstairs, full dress, full battle gear, whatever, and then then they'd take you out. We'd spend the night out in what they used to call Torres's Trail, out at Fort Bragg. They'd wake you up 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they would say, "Okay, your position's been compromised. We have to, beat feet, DD miles, what we used to call it, and then they'd make us crawl through this obstacle course, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and then they'd be the cadre there would be walking alongside you and kicking mud in your face and just saying, "Come on, quit. You want to quit?" I watched some of the SEAL training in Discovery and the Discovery Station, and some of the same kind of the harassment and stuff was the same kind of thing we got back there. They wanted you. They were just trying to see who would be willing to stay in. So yeah, we had quite a few drop out in that first phase of training. And if they washed out of that, they were automatic. Usually everybody that washed out got sent right to Vietnam. Went over with usually an airborne unit, or some guys weren't lucky enough to get assigned to an airborne unit, they'd get assigned to a leg unit. Some went to NCO school at Fort Benning. It all depended on why you were leaving the training. But after the 8 weeks of phase 1 training, we then went through some more aptitude testing and interviews with officers and other selective people, and we were told what MOS we were going to be trained in. Because in Special Forces, you could either be light weapons, communications, demolitions engineer, or medic, or if you were a senior NCO, you could go into operations intelligence, O&I. When I went through mine, I said that I wanted to go through medical training. I wanted to become a medic, which the medic training was about 18 months long. for Special Forces medics. And they said that my aptitude was, my scores was not such that I would qualify for that, but I begged and begged and begged. I guess because I had done so well in Phase 1 training, they said, okay, we'll give you a little shot, we'll let you go through your, the 91A, the first basic medic course, and we'll see how you do. And but they said they wanted me to continue with the light weapons and go light weapons. And I said I didn't want to. But I went through 91A, aced it, and after you did the 8 weeks of basic medical training, you then went to, if I can remember all this correctly, we then went to 10 weeks of what they called Phase 2 medical training, which was training down at Fort Sam Houston. The 91A basic course was all emergency medical care, which was the actual basic course that all combat medics take. And so after we finished that, then we went down to Fort Sam Houston, and it was there that we went through medical school. Our instructors were doctors. We were instructed in all kinds of signs and symptoms of different diseases, treatment for diseases. We took pharmacology, we took lab courses, we took surgical procedure courses. 10 weeks of intensive medical training, 7 days a week, if I remember correctly. It seemed like 7 days a week. And again, each time, people would be dropping out. After we finished the 10 weeks of that training down at Fort Sam, then we had 10 weeks of OJT, where we picked a Army hospital, where we would go and we would spend 10 weeks working in the hospital, rotating through the pediatric ward, medical surgical ward, emergency room, all the different areas and stations of the hospitals, the labs, the dental clinic. We were trained in dentistry. We were trained in veterinary medicine. All that was done at Fort Sam, and then we spent this 10 weeks going through all the different areas of the hospital. I did mine at Fort Hood, Texas, which is the most desolate place in the earth, I think. That's where the 1st Armored Division was, and actually a lot of the guys from Afghanistan and Iraq came out of Fort Hood. It's just all desert there. It's just desert, that's it. So I spent 10 weeks there at Fort Hood, Burnell Army Hospital. Had some great experiences there. Working in the hospital there. It was there that I actually encountered my first DOA, my first real experience with someone who had died. And actually, I took care of him in the emergency room. It was a soldier who rolled over in a Jeep and died in the emergency room. And they asked if I wanted to go through the autopsy, so I went right through the autopsy experience with him. What had happened was, when the Jeep rolled over, it just crushed his skull a little bit, because there was no visible signs of why he would have died. But the pressure had just pushed on his skull, and the basal bone here just went like that and ruptured. All he had was a little bit of blood coming in his ear. That's all the bones, basal bone just went up and hemorrhaged his brain. But that was my first autopsy experience too, and I had many more there. But it was my first delivery at Burnell Army Hospital, working in the OB/GYN ward. But every medic that went through SF training just loved working in their OJ. That's what we call their OJT. It was a real experience, and it really was when a lot of the guys washed out too.
If they washed out, did they stay in Special Forces, or were they gone?
I'm not sure if at that stage I don't think at that stage you could stay in Special Forces. They just normally would go right to another unit. Once we got into the dog lab area, which was further on down in our training, if you washed out, you could rotate and go back into a second, into a class that's coming up.
Mhm.
But up until that point, I think most of the guys that washed out, I never saw them again, and I don't think they went through a later class. I think they were just all assigned to another conventional Army unit. But after OJT at Fort Hood, Texas, we then went back to Fort Bragg, and I'm trying to think if it was at that time we had one more. No, I think that when we came back was when we had our dog lab. And back in the 60s, 67, 68, it wasn't as much controversial as it got later years, but after a while the SPCA got a hold of the idea that we were shooting dogs and then operating on them. And so I heard that they disbanded that. But what our dog lab entailed for us is that we worked in surgical teams, and each of us were given a patient. We had to choose, give our patient a physical, which a dog. We couldn't refer to him as a dog. We referred to him as our patient. Give it a physical, make sure that it was healthy enough to survive all the procedures that we would be doing. If our patient died during any of those procedures, you're out. You go back, you rotate, and you're allowed to rotate one back. If you wash out again, then you're out. But if your patient dies, you rotate back. If another patient dies, or if you fail to do a procedure correctly, you're out. But we had to make sure our patient was healthy enough to survive all the procedures. And then we took them out, and if we gave them the okay, we took them out and we shot them. And one of the things that we did immediately is we then take them into the emergency room. Our surgical team one of us was a surgeon, we had an assistant surgeon, and an anesthesiologist, you had an OR tech, scrub tech, outside circulator. There was a regular circulating team, or a surgical team. And each surgeon had his turn of shooting his patient, and then you bring him into the room, and as a surgical team, you had to do a IV cut down on the dog, which is finding the vein, cutting in, and making a surgical incision so that you can get an IV started. Then you go through and do a wound debridement with treating the gunshot
So
wound.
you shot them in the wound then?
Yep.
Always shot him in the same place?
Usually in the thigh. Yep, in the back corner thigh.
What type of weapon?
22.
22.
Yep. And then we would do a wound debridement on it, and we were not allowed to use any kind of antibiotics. It was just all aseptic procedure and debriding, no antibiotics, and just changing the dressings, combating infection that way. And then we waited for it to heal. Once it healed, you passed that surgical procedure. The next surgical procedure was the IV cut down, the wound debridement. Then you would do a tracheotomy on the patient. After the tracheotomy, you do an amputation. And once the amputation was done, you had a choice. You could either terminate the patient with an intracardial injection of sodium pentothal, or if you've really gotten attached to your patient, you could keep them. There were quite a few three-legged dogs running around Fort Bragg because some guys really gotten attached to their dogs, and so they kept them. I terminated my patient, but that was the dog lab. If you get through dog lab okay, then you've actually finished your technical training phase of medical, and then next is you sit for the boards, and you go before a board of doctors, and they fire questions at you. And then you go through a practical...
No, these are Army doctors, or
Army
they...
medical doctors.
Okay.
Yeah. Special forces,
Mhm.
Army medical doctors that would just fire questions.
So they're all special forces also, okay.
And that was quite intense, quite an experience. And if you passed that, then you were awarded your 91B qualification, your MOS. You became you finished your MOS training, which then enabled you to go through phase 2 of Special Forces training, which phase 2 was another 8 weeks of more of the tactics and techniques, a lot of psychological operations, relating with people, because actually we were teachers, as much as with all the sneaky Pete and covert things that Special Forces did. Our main job was teachers. We were to go in and mobilize people and work with them, live with them, and so we did a lot of study of culture. We did a lot of study of relating with people, a lot of the psychological operations, and more counter-guerrilla operations. We had 8 weeks of this kind of stuff, and then we had a final FTX. And after that 8 weeks, if you successfully completed that, then you were awarded a flash that you could then put on your beret, and that flash signified which unit you were assigned to. Back then, there was either the 1st in Okinawa, the 7th, which was at Bragg, the 6th, which was at Bragg, the 3rd. The 6th was supposed to be in Asia, the Mideast. The 3rd, which was in Africa. The 7th was at Bragg, the 8th was in Panama, the 5th was in Vietnam, and the 10th was in Bad Tolz, Germany. Needless to say, everybody wanted the 5th, that's why you went to SF, but I got assigned to the 3rd Special Forces Group. And I did make it through. Most of the guys that made it through medics, because of the length of time that it took to go through there, because by then I'd been in the Army almost 2 years. Most of the guys graduated that were medics made E5 when they finished. When I came out, I was still in E3, even though I topped, especially if you graduated in the top 5. And I graduated 3rd in my class, but I still only was in E3, because we kind of messed up when we got back to Bragg. I was always getting in trouble. Not serious trouble, I just didn't follow the rules and stuff. So my roommate, he finished number 1 in the class, and I was number 3. He made it to sergeant. I stayed at PFC. Part of the problem was when we came back from Fort Sam Houston, we were supposed to be living in the barracks, but we didn't think we were older, and we just got an apartment off post, and we got caught a couple of times, and then being off post, and we weren't living in an apartment when we were supposed to be, so I would get passed over for promotions and things. But when I finished training group, I graduated as by E3, and most of the guys that were medics were all E5. So when they got assigned to a team, most medics were E5s. But here I went to a team with the 3rd as an E3, which kind of set the stage for some more problems that I encountered. Because the 3rd, we were supposed to be going to Africa, but I was stationed at Fort Bragg. Being an E3, most of the other guys that were E3 were usually the light weapons or commo guys. I would always, the E3s would always be stuck with guard duty, KP, extra duty, buffing the headquarters, floors and stuff. So during the day we'd be doing playing Army stuff, and working as a team and going out and doing all these training things and stuff. And then in the evening, they always needed somebody to do KP, and always needed somebody for extra duty cleaning up headquarters barracks. Because I was in E3, I always got stuck doing that. And the usual routine was you go to KP one day after your training for the day, and because I always heard that once you finished all your training, and you get assigned to a team, it would just be like a regular job. And I thought, that's great. You work, 8 to 5 or whatever, and then you're off. Well, it was. I worked 8 to 5, but then, okay, need KP, Beikirch, KP, So the next day, okay, we need somebody to buff the headquarters, buff and polish the headquarters building. Beikirch, report to headquarters, Next day, need guard duty, need somebody for guard duty. Beikirch, guard duty. And so that was my routine for a long, long time, couple months. And I said, this got to be something better than this going But after guard duty, you would usually end up having a day off, you know. So on one of my day offs, I don't know if you're going to get to how I ended up going to Vietnam, because I'm leading into how I ended up going to Vietnam. One of my days off, I went down to Fayetteville, and just started, you know, went to one of the bars, and just started drinking. And the last thing I remember is every 20 minutes having to go out and put a nickel in the meter so that I wouldn't get a parking ticket. That's the last thing I remember. Next thing I do, I'm waking up, and I'm just aching all over. And I look around, and nothing looks familiar, and I look over and I see bars. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what do they do now? And didn't even recognize the bars, you know, it wasn't military. And what had happened was, the next thing I know is my team sergeant's there, and he goes, Beikirch, you really messed up this time. I said, what happened? And he goes, well, from what I've been told, I went and got in my car to try to drive back to Fort Bragg, left Fayetteville, and started bouncing off parked cars. The Fayetteville police started chasing me. I started running. Went out on the 95. They called the state police. State police tried to set up a roadblock. I ran a roadblock. They ran me off the road. And when I came out of the car, I came out with a billy club I used to carry, and I started swinging the billy club at the North Carolina State Police. And they beat me up bad. They beat me up real bad. And so I was in the jail with beat up body, facing assault with a deadly weapon, hit and run, driving while intoxicated, all these charges. And my teams, I said, what do I do? And he said, I'd get yourself a lawyer. Because he said, if the civilian courts find you guilty, the military will just tack onto it, and he said, you'll be in real big trouble. So I said, okay, I went and I got a lawyer. I went down and I talked with this guy who eventually became the mayor of Fayetteville, so I must have picked a good guy. I went and told him my story, and he kind of just shook his head like, here I'm a lawyer in an army town. I've heard this story 100 times before at least. And without even looking up, he just said, how quick can you get yourself out of the country? I said, what do you mean? He said, get yourself out of the country. We'll go to the court, and I'll tell them that you had received orders to leave the country, and you were just down commiserating, and let's have mercy on, because you're going to be going over fighting for our country. And he said, the judge will give you some leniency. He said, but you got to get yourself to Vietnam. So I went back to him, and the team sergeant says, we're not going to Vietnam, Gary. He said, maybe we might be going to Mali. We were on alert to be going to Mali, which is on the west coast of Africa. And I said, nah, that won't work. So I don't know what to tell you. And I needed money. And not only did I need to get out of the country, but I needed money to pay the lawyer, because he said, my fee is $600. And I didn't have $600. So I went down to the re-enlistment sergeant. I said, I'd like to re-enlist. He goes, what do you want to re-enlist for? I said, I want to re-enlist to go to Vietnam. He goes, what? I said, yep, I want to re-enlist to go to Vietnam. And back then, they had these variable re-enlistment bonuses. And at the time, the SF medic, our bonus was, we had a VRB of only like 1. And some guys would get like thousands of dollars to re-enlist. I got about $700 to re-enlist. Just enough to cover my fine. Or not even my fine, my lawyer's fee. So I went and I told him, I'm on my way to Vietnam. I'll be gone in 30 days. And he said, great, let's go to court. And we went to court. He did all his legalese jargon. I had no idea what the judge was saying, or he was saying. And he just said, stand up. So I'm standing up. The judge had his thing. I looked at him. I said, so what's happened? He said, because I heard him say guilty. He said, you're guilty of reckless driving. All the charges have been dropped. I was found guilty of reckless driving and fined $100. And I was on my way to Vietnam. So it was either go to Vietnam or go to jail, literally. But yeah.
So you were transferred then to the 5th?
I went to, well, you had your 30-day leave, and most of the guys, you know, you always ended up late. You know, you were supposed to report at Fort Washington, you know,
Fort Lewis?
Fort Lewis, Washington, yeah. That's where I took off from. And most of the guys say, you know, always show up late. So what are you going to do, send me to Vietnam? You know, so I was supposed to be there a certain day, but I had a friend who was stationed at Fort Lewis, and he was married, and he lived out there. So I stayed out there probably a week beyond my date that I was supposed to. Which you'd think I'd learn, and I'd just start following the rules, but I didn't. I just never really paid much attention to that stuff. So I reported in late Fort Lewis. Again, I was at PFC, even though I have the beret on, and they start hassling me right away about, you know, doing duty at Fort Lewis and all that stuff. So I got stuck with some extra duty there, and plus I was late a week. Ended up going over, and my name wasn't on the manifest. So by the time I got over to Vietnam, nobody was I wasn't then when I was supposed to have been there, and didn't have me on a new one. So I ended up staying at, I think maybe it was Cameron when I went in, where I got off or something.
When did you arrive there?
July of '69. Yeah. July '69, and I ended up, because I was not on orders because I was reporting late, and because I was a PFC, they assigned me at some holding company down there, and here I ended up, you know, same old duty again, you know, KP, cleaning up burnout latrines, which is a lot of fun. And I'm thinking, this is what I went through all my training for. You know, graduated third in my class, and here I am burning, you know, burnout latrines.
I think it was mainly because of your last name starting with a B. I
Yeah,
ran into
probably.
the same situation because my name started with a C. So they always went to the first part of the alphabet for
all that duty
details.
stuff. Yeah. Yeah, so I remember one day I was just sitting there, I had just finished pouring the diesel into the 55-gallon drums, and I'm stirring it and burning, and I'm wearing a beret. And this sergeant major came walking by. Don't know what his name was. And he said, "Hey, soldier, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm burning shit, Sergeant Major. That's what I'm doing." And he goes, "You want to do that forever?" And I said, "No, Sergeant Major. I want to get out of here." And he said, "Come on with me." And he just said, he took me over to some place and said, "I want this guy out of here. I want him to come up to Khantoum." And he said, "When you get to Khantoum, come see me." And he said, I'm with CCC at Khantoum." And I said, "Great, Sergeant Major." So he got me out of Cameron Bay and got me at least to Trang. So because all SF guys had to go through this, you know, acclimatization training. Everybody had to go through a couple weeks of training there in the Trang. And I don't know if I would have got stuck at Cameron Bay forever. I may have even ended up in a convention unit if he hadn't pulled me out of there. Because I'd heard that a lot of SF guys that went over as rogues kind of ended up in convention units.
That CCC was at Command Control Central?
Yep. Yep. So he got me at least on orders to go to Nha Trang. Matter of fact, he got a chopper to fly me up to Nha Trang, and where the 5th headquarters was. And I reported into the headquarters, and I started going on in the cycle now. You know, so I went through the in-country training, went out to Entree Island, which was an experience for us. Part of the training there out at Entree Island was every day we used to have to walk to the top of the mountain with like 2 sandbags on our backs, you know, for training. And it was just really crazy because we'd always heard that SF knew how to live. And here we get climbing up to this top of this mountain, up in the top of the mountain, SF had a Dairy Queen up there. There's a Dairy Queen station up there. And in the Dairy Queen was a couple slot machines. And there was this SF sergeant that used to run the Dairy Queen up on top of the mountain on Entree Island. Oh, there used to be some communications unit up there too. But I thought, yeah, this is a great unit. I'm in the right unit. This is where I should be. SF. Glad I came here. So when I finished that training, they said, where are you going? Where do I go? And I said, B Company up out of Pontoon. And so they said, you're a medic, right? I said, yep. And all medics had to spend some time working in the CIDG hospital for a short time just to get used to the medical procedures in Vietnam and the medical support that was there, because the CIDG hospital in Pleiku was our major source of our support station for all the A-teams and all the special operations that came out of B Company, out of 2 Corps. And so I flew into Pleiku, started working at the CIDG hospital, and loved it. This is what we've been trained for, doing the medical care and working with the people. And I just really, really loved it. The thing is that right across the street from the CIDG hospital was this Mike Force unit, and I developed friendship with a medic that was with the Mike Force. And he was saying, "No, you don't want to go to CCC. Come on over to Mike Force." And I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm only by that time I think I got an E. No, I had to sit when I was at Pleiku, and I got promoted to E4. I said, I'm only E4. I can't make much choice. They got to go where they send me." And he goes, "I'll see what I can do." So they changed my orders from CCC to go to Mike Force, but I had to be waiting for a while. And so then I still stayed at the CIDG hospital. And while we were there, and while I was waiting, this old E7 medic, Dan McGinley, who's still alive, and he's down at Fort Bragg, great man, taught me an awful lot about medicine. Liked what he saw as far as what I could do with the medical. And he said, "Gary, you'd be a waste in Mike Force." I said, "Why don't you go out to some A-teams?" I said, "What is that?" He said, "Here." So he got me rotating, going out to different A-teams around 2 Corps, which that was. I'd go out and I'd spend a few days, and the medic that was on site would then come in. And an A-team was a special forces team that actually lived in the jungles and supported the Montagnards. Most of them in 2 Corps was mostly Montagnards that we were with because of the highlands. And so I got to go around to about 10 or 12 of the A-teams that were in 2 Corps, and in the C team out of Pleiku, and out of the B team, B-24. And I loved that. So I came back and I said, yeah, I want to go to an A-team. And so Max said, "I got just the A-team for you." And he said that he was the first medic on that camp, Doc Siang. And he said, that's my camp. And he said, "I'll send you out there." And so I got my orders changed again, and I went to Doc Siang as the A-team medic. And that's how I ended up at Doc Siang.
What type of medicine did you practice? Did you have a lot of gunshot wounds or tropical diseases or everything?
Everything. There were usual gunshot wounds, amputations, the usual accidents, somebody, Montagnard getting drunk and blowing off his arm with a grenade, and a lot of malaria, a lot of upper respiratory infections, snake bites. Had a couple people mauled by tigers. All kinds of parasitic diseases. skin diseases, those kinds of things. We would actually run a regular sick call, being the medic on site. There's usually, when I went out there, I was the junior medic. Doc Nelson was he was the E7. He had been the senior medic on site. He was another great guy. But we would run sick call every day. Well, actually, by the time we got there, we had trained we would go out there, we would identify medics or Montagnards that we thought had the aptitude, and we would train them to actually hold sick call. People would line up, there'd be somebody there that would take their complaint, they would go to a yard medic that would do vitals, blood pressure, temperature, those kinds of things. If they felt that they needed to have blood drawn, they would send them to the lab, and we'd have a mountain yard lab tech that would draw blood, make smears, lab smears to look for, do WBC counts, do differentials to see if there was infections, do malarial smears, stool smears, and we would train the medics on how to do that. And it was quite an operation. And if there was anything serious, more serious that they felt they couldn't handle, then we would step in. The surgery, those kinds of things, we would always do, although they would assist us. If it was a real surgical necessity or things like that, most of the time we would send them down to the C team in Pleiku, where there was a Sergeant Owen Wright, who was, even the doctors at the 71st Evac, the American doctors, said he was the best surgeon that they had ever seen, and he was an E7 sergeant, but he would do all kinds of bone marrow taps, he'd do skin grafts. He was just a tremendous surgeon. But we would send those kinds of real serious surgical procedures down there for the SF medics and the C team to take care of. They had some real good medics down there. That's where Mac was, the guy that taught me a lot about medical surgical things. But on the site, in the camp, we would everything that you could think of that a village doctor would do, we did. Dental, pulling teeth. The yards loved to have their teeth pulled. They all come in, pull my teeth. They want them all, because for them it was a sign of beauty not to have any teeth, and some of them.
You always were well equipped?
Yeah. It really, it was really, unless the weather socked us in, and for us, the weather wasn't that bad. Some of the camps further up, Mangbrook, Doc Peck, many times they'd get socked in with weather. But for us, we never really had too much problem getting supplies, although Chopper was the only way into our camp. Some of the camps further on down, they did have a highway, Highway 14, that went from Pleiku to Khartoum, and then Khartoum up to some of the other smaller camps like Ben Het. I think there was a highway that went all the way to Ben Het. But that was the furthest camp you could go by road. Then the rest of the time it was just all Chopper. But it was our job to make sure that we, first of all, did not get overcrowded with a dispensary. Like, if you didn't want to keep too many people in the dispensary, because if your camp ever did get hit, you need to have space. And so if somebody was really sick or long-term care, they'd have to be sent down to the hospital in Pleiku, and especially for surgical procedures. We would do a lot of the emergency surgery and childbirth and things like that. They wouldn't go down there for that anyhow. The yards had this birthing pole that and the midwives used to do that, and the witch doctor. Every camp, the yards all had witch doctors. That was the other thing. That was another big challenge, is to try to develop a rapport with a witch doctor that you were working with. But dental work, all the different diseases, lab work, preventive medicine, building latrines, trying to teach the yards how to, hygiene, sanitation, those kinds of things, purifying water, veterinary medicine, all that fell into the direction of the camp medic. And I had this one medic, Tot, who wanted to be a medic. wanted to be a medic so bad, but he just didn't have the aptitude. So I made him my preventive medicine specialist, and he used to just spray the latrines and clean the latrines. We built a latrine for these yards, and the engineer, demolitions guy, he and I built a real nice burnout latrines, and had toilet seats on them. You know, I remember the first time the yards looked at them with the toilet seats, and they ended up just standing on the toilet seats and squatting. They did not eat. Is this right? This right box seat? Is this how you use it? Oh, there's some funny stories that came out of that year that I was there. A lot of funny experiences with the yards. It was just great. It was to think that I was 24, a 24-year-old kid would be responsible for the health and welfare of over 2,000 people, because that's how many mountain yards were in Daxiang. There were 2,000 people, and it was amazing. It's one of the greatest experiences in my life, was that.
I see you still wear a mountain yard bracelet?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I used to have a bunch of them, but when I got shot, and I was taken to the 71st, a lot of the medics in the hospital, they would take all the yard bracelets off and all the beads and other things that the guys that were in the bush would get, and they'd keep it for themselves. So I lost all my stuff, but I'd gotten in touch with Mac again, and I said I wanted a yard bracelet, and this was a yard bracelet that was given to him by a yard that I knew. Yit was his name. So he gave this one to me. So this was still given to me by a mountain yard, but it wasn't one that I had when I was over there, because all that stuff was stolen, as was most of my photographs and everything else. When the camp got overrun, I lost all that stuff. But yeah, there was something happened to me in Vietnam that was very special. Growing up, my parents were divorced when I was like 5, and I never saw my dad again. And being a divorced parent back then was not as popular as it was now. And consequently, my mom had to move an awful lot. I went to 11 different schools before I hit 9th grade, and just moving and living with different people. And so as I look back on it now, I never really felt like I had a home anywhere until I got to Vietnam. When I hit Dak Siang, that was my home. That was my place where I planted myself, and I said, I'm staying here forever. This is my place. I planned on staying there forever. I wanted to marry and just stay right there. But it was a real life-changing experience, being not only in SF, but being in the situations that SF put me in, being in that camp, responsible for those people, developing the friendships, developing a love between you, with only 10 other Americans. That was it. I never saw anybody except for just maybe those 10 Americans. And then every once in a while we would get some Mike force coming through, going over to Laos, because our camp was on the border. We were on the Laotian border. We were 3 miles from Laos. And our main job was to pull surveillance on the Ho Chi Minh Trail that came near us. And so that's where we usually held most of our operations. And the CCC and Mike Force used to use our camp as a jumping off spot for going into Laos for cross-border operations. So once in a while I'd see an American that was with Mike Force or an American that was with the Special Operations, but most of the time I just was with the Montagnards and stayed right there. I kind of went native. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What kind of food did you exist on? Native food, or did you have sea rations or lurk rations?
Oh, we had steaks. We'd get guys from the Air Force coming in with the caribous would land. Every once in a while, each of us would rotate and go into Khartoum, and we'd contact the Air Force guys there and say, okay, we got some AKs, we got some nice Chi-Coms out there, we got some nice Montagnard crossbows made by the Montagnards, we got all these nice things. Let's work out a deal. Drop some steaks off for us, drop some beer off for us, and then we'll give you all this stuff. And so then the Air Force would come in with their caribous, and they would land at our airstrip. They'd wheel off all this stuff, and we'd give them all the souvenir stuff. So most of the time we had really good steaks. We ate a lot of rice, did eat a lot of rice.
Mm-hmm.
And actually I did eat a lot of the Montagnard food. The Montagnards would love to go on an operation because that's where their homes were. Their homes was in the jungle. We came in, our tribe that we worked with Sedang, the Sedang Montagnard. And we would take them out of their villages and build these underground, fortifications, and we'd say, this is where you got to be to keep safe. But they did it because the NVA the NVA actually wiped out a Montagnard village that was right near us, Doc Soot, back in '65. Total, terrible massacre of the Montagnards. And that's when the Doc Pack and Doc Siang A camps got started with the survivors of that massacre. So they loved to go out on operations and doing combat reconnaissance and ambushes and things like
Now,
that.
what kind of weapons did they carry?
M16s, some M16s, sometimes carbines, A1, A2 carbine, which was the old Korean weapon.
Mm-hmm.
M60 machine guns.
As a medic, did you carry a weapon too?
Oh yeah.
What did you carry?
I carried a Car-15. Again, because I was cross-trained. My alert position when our camp, whenever we had to get a probe or anything, my alert position was a 4-deuce mortar. I fired a 4-deuce mortar. So we did not adhere to the strict guidelines like other combat medics, being non-weaponed personnel. We were cross-trained and did just about everything. Everybody was cross-trained so that we could fill in case somebody got hurt. But they would love to go into operations because when we go out there, they'd be pulling up roots and all these different things, and they'd go, Moxie, this is number one, and they would show you that the different things to eat, the different things to avoid. One of the things that we were advised to do is to develop a real good relationship with a Montagnard, and let that person become your contact person, your best friend, because he was going to be the one that you could count on and trust the most. And pick somebody from the security unit. We had a security team. These were people that we were really sure of. And so I picked this was my bodyguard. Deo was his name. He was
Can you hold that
If you
photo
hold it.
yeah,
right in front of you?
yeah, Deo. He's about 15 years old, and this is me right here. This was our interpreter, one of our interpreters, Bray. But we were advised to cultivate a relationship with these guys, and he'd be your bodyguard. Every time I went on operation, Deo was with me. When we'd be ready to set up camp, he'd have my hammock set up within 5-10 minutes. He'd come in with all kinds of weeds and bushes and stuff and say, this is going to make a good soup, Boxy, good soup. He was only 15 years old. And, he was the one that really showed me how to live in the jungles. And this was, now the ages, Bray was only 14. This was Bray's brother, Brer. He was 17. He's the oldest one here, 17. We had a Montagnard in our camp, in our company. He was 12 years old. He was an M60 machine gunner. His name was He. I think that's how you pronounce it, He. We were on an operation and he stepped on a booby trap and lost both his legs. But whenever we'd go on operations and stuff, Deo or any of the Montagnards that were out there, they'd come back from an operation with more stuff than they took out there, because that was when they could get their food that they were supposed to, that they really enjoyed. So we did have a lot of American food, the steaks and things like that, but and rice. But like I said, I kind of went native, and I would eat mostly what the Montagnards ate, including dog. We ate dog. I didn't really like dog, and I didn't eat that much, but I had to try it once in a while, just to make them happy.
Okay, we're going to stop right here and change tapes. Okay, we're back up.
The experiences that you have there are just like the experiences that anybody would have living in a village or something. It's there was never a boring day. And for them, they would take the combat and they would take the probes, they would take the incoming as just like we might take a traffic jam, and that always amazed me, that they would be able to have and maintain a normal semblance of life with all these other things going on that would just upset people here in the world, as we'd call it. That's why when I came back, people would talk about difficulties, and I would think, difficulties? My gosh, you don't know what difficulty is.
Was there a tribal memory of what had happened to that village you talked about in '65? I mean,
Yeah.
did they
Yeah.
probably pass that down?
Yeah, there were a number of, I'm not sure where I have them. There were a number of older men that, this is a picture of an aerial view of the camp. There were some older men that actually had fought with Ho Chi Minh, had fought with the French against during World War II.
Try to zoom in on everything here. Okay, all right.
Okay.
I had some pictures of camp. I thought they were in here. But yeah, they would pass on the oral histories. That was the big thing, because the Montagnards didn't really have a written language. These were some of the ladies in the...
Okay, got it.
Now the ground would be flat, and then we would have concertina wire. We'd clear out fields of fire, a couple 100 meters out, and then we'd have all kinds of wire and things. And then you'd have a sandbag wall, but the yards themselves, you actually dug holes in the ground, and they would live underground.
Okay, got it.
Here's another.
Okay.
And then here's a morning roll call. And you can see the concertina wire and some of the defenses that's further out there.
Now, did you have a minefield also?
Yeah,
Or did you...
yeah, there was mines, food gas in the wall, all kinds of booby traps.
Okay.
But yeah, the older men, I think that must have been on a CD disc. I had some pictures of some old men just sitting around talking, and they would pass on the history to with the Montagnards, and it was just, they're tremendously proud people, especially the Sedang. As I found out later on, the Sedang were probably one of the most feared tribes among the Montagnards, and I found that out from some contact with Christian Missionary Alliance missionaries.
Mhm.
But these were very, very proud people. And consequently, that's why the Vietnamese had so much trouble with them.
How often was your village attacked?
Probably a couple times a month you get incoming and things. Prior to the siege in April, it had been 3 times had been the object of a concentrated assault 3 times, and the rest of the time it's just probing kinds of things, sappers once in a while, anybody to just once in a while you get some artillery lobbed into the camp. The camp was actually in the Poco River Valley, and it was put right on the banks, right on a riverbed, or by the side of a river, and mountains all the way around it. I often said it looked like it was designed by Custer. Why didn't they build it on the mountains, right in the valleys? But that's where they decided to build it. And quite often when we take incoming or something like that, it would always come from the mountains. But most of the contact, we'd always usually get in contact whenever we'd send an operation out. We knew they were there, they knew where we were too.
It was always NVA?
NVA, yeah. And if we'd go out and look for them, we'd always find them. But most of the time we were just looking to see what kind of, if there was any intensity or increase in the movement up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That was our major purpose.
Did the sappers ever get through the defenses?
Not at those kinds of things. When the camp came under siege during the battle, they got through. Yeah.
You want to tell us about that?
Yeah. I was trying to think of some of the funny stories, and like the daily life in the camp. It was big. Some of the things we do, we would always take the kids down to. We built a swimming hole for the kids. We'd drive through the camp, and they'd all load on a 2.5 truck, and we'd drive them down, and we'd always go swimming with them. Always have. They loved movies. They would always have. When the chopper came out with the mail, 2 or 3 times a week, they'd always bring a new movie out, and they loved John Wayne movies. I remember one where he played a firefighter, oil.
Oh, yes, putting the oil rigs out.
Putting the oil fires out. Yeah, that was a big one. They always loved to see that.
How about the Green Beret one? Did they watch that one with John Wayne?
I remember going to see that, but I don't think we ever watched that in the camp. No, we didn't see that one. I think that was still pretty popular in circulation at that time, so we didn't get that, but we got some of those fire rig, or the oil rig firefighters. A real funny story that happened was that we had a water buffalo that was out there that had infected one of the horns and antlers, and water buffaloes were very special and precious out there. So we had to try to take care of the water buffalo. But I don't know if you've ever tried to clean and dress a water buffalo's antler. My gosh, that thing it would gore you, So myself and Dale and Chom, he was one of my main medics here. Chom, 3 of us.
Which one was Chom?
Chom here. This is Chom. We got a lasso around the water buffalo, and we tied it to a post, and then I said, okay, Chom, have him chase you around. So Chom gets and starts hitting him, and he's running around the thing, and as he's running around, the rope's getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and finally the water buffalo had his head buried right to the ground because he couldn't go anywhere. And we were able to finally work on the water buffalo, but they got a kick out of that. It took us probably a good couple hours to finally come up with that strategy. Prior to that, we were horsing around trying to tackle the water buffalo and roll them over and all this stuff. And they just, well, they're only kids. They're 14, 15, 16 years old, 17 years old. They're just a lot of fun. And then we had an incident with Chom, which is probably one of my most tragic incidents, where Chom's child had he brought him in sick and couldn't figure out what it was. The high fever, and really getting bad. I remember working late at night doing some blood when the temperature had peaked and stuff, and so I finally found some malaria in the blood. And because the child had been sick such a long time, I decided to give it an injection rather than giving. Usually I would give him in an elixir and then give it to him orally, but I gave her a shot. I went into anaphylactic shock and died. She was like a couple months old, and we just worked hard on that infant. And I remember Chom being there, and I was still giving mouth to mouth and CPR and everything. And finally, Chom just put his hand on my shoulder and said, "It's okay, Boxy. She's gone." That's probably one of my most haunting memories out of that whole experience in Vietnam, is losing that child. And then the other one, I had mentioned a witch doctor, because I'm trying to think of things that stick in my mind. I had mentioned working with the witch doctor, and I had a deal worked out where I would provide him chickens for his sacrifices and some of the other things that he might need for his little rites and things that he would do, if he would agree to help, come to me if there was something that he couldn't deal with. And we had a pretty good relationship. But there was one of our security guys whose name was Yoy. And for some reason, Yoy had ticked off the witch doctor. And that's something you don't want to do. You don't want to make a witch doctor mad. And that witch doctor put a curse on him. And once the family found out about it, the family just moved him right out of the house. And so I made Yoy a little room in the dispensary and to stay. And he just started deteriorating, started vomiting and diarrhea, fevers. There was nothing that I could get with all the different tests that would indicate what was happening with him. But he started losing weight seriously and couldn't keep anything down. So I medevaced him back to Pleiku. And about 5 days later, they sent him back. He died. And they said, cause of death, unknown. And we had a funeral for Yoy. And the Montagnard funerals go all night, And we were at a funeral for Yoy that morning, probably about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, when our camp came under siege. And the morning of April 1st, this was 1970, which is when the action for which I was awarded the Medal of Honor, when that happened. But we were at an all-night funeral for that guy who had died from a witch doctor's curse. I believe that. There was no other things in the hospital in Pleiku. Couldn't find no signs of any kind of infection, no kinds of any kind of elevated blood count, no physiological organic reason for the nausea, vomiting, high fever. He just died. But we were at that funeral when the siege started. Do you want me to get into the siege now?
Sure.
Yeah, it started with a lot of incoming. hours and hours of just rockets and artillery coming in. And at that time in the morning, usually the only people that were up like around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning would be the women, because they'd start making the meals, and then the kids, they'd be up that late. So when the incoming started, we were in bunkers like this, underground, in the bunkers. And like I said earlier, my alert position was a 4-deuce mortar pit. So at first I don't think that we even thought that this was just ordinary incoming. Given the volume, we knew something was different this time. And so I was at the funeral with Pat DeZini, who was our commo man. He's right here. And we took off. He went to his alert position, which was in the commo bunker. I went to my alert position, which was the 4-deuce mortar, which was located right outside the dispensary, because I was going to be meeting the medics. And I was going to be meeting them and handing the medical gear out. I think I got hit right away. There was just, like I said, there was just explosions all over the place. I remember getting knocked down a couple times, but nothing really serious at this particular point. I remember when I got to the dispensary, Chom was there. All of a sudden, not surprisingly, Deo was there, and I said, "Okay, we gotta start handing out the medical gear to the yard medics, because each yard medic had a company that they were assigned to, so they were supposed to be taking care of them at different locations along the wall. The camp was built in a square, and inside the camp we had 2 105 howitzers. We had a John Wayne tower with a 50 caliber machine gun in a John Wayne tower, and then we had 106 recoilless rifles at different locations along the wall. And then each company was assigned one wall, and we had medics that were assigned to each company. And so I was making sure that all the medics had their medical gear out of the dispensary, because that early in the morning, the people that were getting hit were women and kids. And already, even as I was making my way to the medical bunker, I was seeing dead bodies, women and kids. And I remember thinking that it was really kind of like surreal. It didn't seem real, what I was seeing. Body parts just lying around. It's not something you see too much of, and you just think it can't be real. You just kind of ignore it. When I got to the medical bunker, I remember meeting Chom. He took some stuff and went off. Deo stayed with me. My main medic, whose name was Tung, he wasn't there yet. So I ran to where his house was, jumped down over the sandbags, and again, now if you can imagine this, you have your sandbag walls, and then they would dig these trenches that would be below the sandbag walls, and then into the side of the earth they would dig, and then they have these huge hollowed out areas, and that's where they'd be living underground. And they'd have pallets that they'd be sleeping on and stuff under there, and lanterns and stuff. So I'm running along the top of the ground. I jump into the bunker, or into the trench, and I found Tung there, and he was holding the headless body of his wife, and he was just sitting there rocking back and forth, totally out of it. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this, come on, Tung, trying to get him to snap out of it, wake up, we gotta get going. And he was just lifeless for a while. But I was amazed at how quick you can just turn that stuff off. At this point, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid. I was really, really angry. And that anger or whatever had just shut off a lot of the emotions. I never thought I'd be able to look at a headless body and not feel some emotion. But I did. I remember doing that. And sometimes it bothers me that I can look back and see all that stuff and remember it and say, it didn't bother me. You know, you wonder, how human are you, you know? And these were the kinds of thoughts, some of the thoughts that haunted me years and years later, which I still deal with. I saw tongue wasn't going to be useful. So then Cham Yuk had come to me and told me that one of our medics down there had been hit, and that his name was Fair. And Fair was a real nice guy, a good friend of mine. And so I went down there, and I saw that he had gotten hit, tore the whole side of his chest off, and he had what they call the sucking chest wound. You know, you could just see the exposed lungs and everything was just going, and I thought, need something airtight to seal it up. And I said, I remember the 105s came wrapped in large plastic bags. So I started, Deo and I started running to the 105s and to get some of these 105 bags to make a tight seal on Fair's sucking chest wound. As we were going across, running, we saw one of the yards get hit, and we went down, and he was hit really bad, and I started giving him mouth to mouth. I knew I had to get him down to the underground medical bunker, which the entrance was. The dispensaries here, we have the entrance to the medical bunker, which was near the supply house, and the schoolhouse was here, and you had to get over here before you could get down to the entrance of the underground medical bunker. Because by this time, every building above ground had been leveled. The Americans that were in a team house, every single one of them was hit right away. Everybody got wounded right away because they had the camp zeroed in. So we knew that there must have been infiltrators within the Vietnamese, the LLDB that was with us. Plus we had maybe about 75 to 100 Vietnamese that were living there doing different jobs and stuff. But we figured that they must have zeroed in that camp. And not only that, but later on, we figured that the Vietnamese, the LLDB, were not pulling the local security like they were supposed to, because what had happened is that the NVA had dug tunnels underneath, you know, from where they were, almost like hundreds and hundreds, almost like a half a kilometer tunnels underground, and they cleared under our wire. And so after the shelling, which lasted 3-4 hours, when that stopped, relatively short time of stopping, they then broke through the surface and they were inside our wires. And so they were just running. They had people coming in that way, then they had the massive ground assaults going across the wires. But I'm getting kind of ahead of myself on it. But the point is that the LLDB didn't provide the security because they were supposed to be providing local security and making sure that there weren't things like this going on. So when I saw one of the yards hit, Deo and I started dragging him, trying to get him to the medical bunker. And that's when I heard a 122 coming in, and you could really hear them. They sound like a train. You can just hear it, and it hit. I remember it hitting the school, And I was about maybe, I would say about 25 feet from the school. And when it landed, I threw myself on the guy that we were working on. The explosion, I remember the blast hitting me, and I felt like I got kicked by a horse. And I literally saw myself flying head over heels. It was like an out-of-the-body thing, you know. I could see myself flying with me, you know, head over heels, and slamming up against the sandbag wall where the 4-deuce mortar was, which was back about another 25, 30 feet. And that concussion, the shrapnel, went into my back here, and that hit my spine. And I have a shrapnel in my spinal column. There's a big scar right across the base of my spine. As soon as I remember landing, Dale was right there. And I tried, he said, "Come on, Boxy, come on." And I tried to get up and I couldn't walk. It was like, later on I found out it was like a concussion to my spinal cord. I thought I'd be paralyzed the rest of my life, but it wasn't. It was just like a concussion. So he wanted to get me to the medical bunker. I said, "No, we can't." So we started back down to where the guy was that we were just working on, and all that was left was just body parts. I mean, he was just blown up all over the place. And looking back on that too, I think, here I was lying on top of him. You know, I was on top of him, protecting him, and I'm still alive, and he's dead. It's another one of those strange things that happens in war. You know, somebody next to you gets shot, you survive. Here I was on top of him. I get wounded, but he gets blown all apart. So Deo and I then start working with people, bringing them down to the medical bunker. I couldn't walk, so we were crawling. And then the shelling had stopped. And that's when the people were breaking through the surface, and they were starting their land assaults, you know, the wave upon wave. And so Dale carried me at this point back out to the wall. We were handing out ammunition and firing, as well as trying to take care of people. I remember we had a 30 caliber machine gun nest, and I remember sitting there and just seeing NVA, just waves of them coming, and just firing into them, and just watching these guys just fall and fall and fall. One newspaper report later on said that afterwards they counted over 1,500 dead just in our wire, just lying in the wire. But we were surrounded by 3 North Vietnamese regiments, over 10,000 North Vietnamese that tried to overrun our camp. And then we had the artillery units that were in the mountains. But we were surrounded for a month, and we had called in B-52 strikes, called in Spooky and Puff and all those other things. But it took a month before the siege was broken. But I remember being carried by Deo through all this time, and then see, a lot of it now I don't know the correct order. There's just like, I'll often explain it, it's like specific incidents imprinted on a card, and somebody just missed all the cards all up, you know, and I don't know what order they're in, but I remember just being at the wall. I remember being told that, I remember seeing the 105s being blown up. I remember it was still early in the morning, and I remember hearing Chris, our XO, who was in the John Wayne Tower, and he was trying to call in air support and call in artillery support from Ben Het, which is about 15 miles away. That's the other funny thing we used to do. And there was one time we'd get a little drunk or something, and we'd start challenging each other. We would call in artillery from Ben Het 15 miles away and try to knock out trees, see who could come the closest to knocking out trees with 175s and 155s from Ben Het. What else do you do when you're living in the jungle, you know? But Chris was up in the John Wayne Tower, and he was I remember Deo was carrying me, Deo and Tut, that PM, my preventive medicine specialist I was telling you about, who was a dud as a medic, but he used to spray for mosquitoes and stuff, and used to clean out the latrines. He was right there with me. He carried me because I couldn't walk, and I remember my pants kept on falling down, and from that one blast, it just tore my pants to shreds. And I remember telling Dale, I gotta get some pants, because I don't want to run around here with everything hanging out, It was funny. I think somehow he must have got me some pants, I think. But then we were going up, I remember carrying me across, and again falling on the ground with the explosions, and then looking up and seeing Chris get blown out of the tower of the B-40 rocket. You just hear the whistling, and then you looked up, and there's Chris up there calling in, illumination rounds and everything, and trying to see things, and next thing you know, the tower blew up. Chris goes flying out of it. So I had Deo take me over there, and we got to Chris. I went to grab him, and his arm came off. And we dragged him down to the medical bunker. It was just hanging. I don't know if he ever lost it. I've just recently been in touch with him again. He owns a business out in Washington, Oregon somewhere. He emailed me, and he just wanted to thank me. He said, because I remember you coming and getting me. And I emailed him back, but I never asked him if he lost his arm. But we've been in contact with him, as well as only 2 other guys that were on my team that I've been in contact with since then. But I remember getting him down. That's another incident that I remember, which is one of the incidents that were written up in the citation. Then I remember going out, again out along the wall, and coming across NVA that were, just running through the wire. It's just like you'd see on the Green Berets, you just firing because they're there. They're just all over the place. And finally, Captain Landers called in B-52 strikes right on the camp and stuff. So then I remember another time getting shot, Deo getting shot, and both of us falling. And then us hearing another explosion coming. You could hear this rocket coming in, and Deo threw himself on top of me. And after the earth pounded, and everything settled, I said, okay, Deo, come on, time to get up, let's go. And he's laying on top of me, and I'm going like this, and he didn't move, and I rolled him over, and his back had been torn to shreds by the explosion. I never saw him again. I'm pretty sure he was killed. I never saw him again, because then Todd grabbed me and called for somebody else, and Todd and another yard carried me for more hours, but I never saw Deo again, which is another thing that haunts me, thinking about that.
Were your wounds ever dressed by anyone? Or?
No, Deo brought me down a couple of times. I remember being brought down there once, and one time I was lying on a stretcher, and we had just gotten, by this time I had become senior medic, and we had this other guy, Dan Noonan. He was a young medic, and he'd only been on site for maybe 3 or 4 weeks, I think. And I remember looking up and seeing Dan look at me, and he goes, oh my gosh, because the second time I got shot, it came through here and we held my stomach. And now this was probably the 3rd time I've been shot. And Dan just goes, I remember him saying, oh my God. And I remember yelling at him and saying, Dan, you don't say that. You don't say that, Dan. And that's when I said, Dale, was it bad? And he goes, yeah. And I said, get me out of here. I'm not going to die down here. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die out there. Until Dale picked me up again and took me back out. And I remember Dan saying, we got to get him out of here. We got to get him out of here. And I said, no, I'm not leaving. And so Dale carried me back out there, and we just kept going around and bringing people down and distributing ammunition and fighting. And, finally, I collapsed. And the other memory that I have is being in the hole where we used to sit to watch the movies. Eventually, that was the beginning of another bunker that we were building, underground bunker. But it's where we used to sit and watch the movies. And I remember sitting there on a stretcher with Dizzy, Pat Dizzini. He's from Blowbelt. You know where Blowbelt is, downstate? It's a small little town.
Which one was that?
Dizzy's right here. He was the commo man. I remember being on the stretcher with Dizzy looking over me, and him saying, "You're going to be okay, Gary. You're going to be okay. We're going to get you out. We're going to get you out." And then we would watch a chopper come in and get blown up. I must have watched 3 choppers. It seems to me like I saw 3 choppers trying to come in and just get blown right out of the sky. They lost 27 choppers and 3 caribou during that siege. But I remember Dizzy saying, "You're going to be okay. We're going to get you out of here." And then I remember one chopper coming in that made it down, and then just being picked up and literally thrown up onto the chopper, and then whisking off, and the medic that was on board the chopper saying, "You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. You're going to make it. You're going to make it." And I kept on saying, "I don't think so. I don't think so." And I was on my way to the 71st Evac in Pleiku. But I didn't want to leave. But I kept track of the siege all the while that I was in Pleiku, all the while it was in Japan. I spent about a year in the hospital afterwards, 10 months in the hospital afterwards. At Valley Forge, I was at Camp Zama, Japan, Pleiku. I developed a pneumonia in Pleiku, in the 71st Evac. I literally did almost die. As a matter of fact, I remember talking to one of the doctors that was there, and he had said, what are you doing? Because I had been in the hospital around maybe November, because I had hepatitis. I medevaced myself down there, and I got better. And he said, "No, you're going to have time to heal. You're going to be on light duty for a good 6 months, And here it is, April, and all of a sudden he sees me back, all shot up, and he's saying, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be on light duty in Cantu." And I kind of just smiled at him, but I spent probably a good 4 days in a coma, in and out of consciousness. And it was at that I really had a life-changing experience, which changed my life dramatically, and eventually led me to becoming a Christian and going to seminary and wanting to go back to Vietnam as a missionary. But then Vietnam fell, and I couldn't go back to Vietnam as a missionary. But it was that hospital bed experiences where I was just scared, called out to, you heard of foxhole conversions. Well, this was a hospital bed conversion where I just said, "God, I'm scared. I think I'm going to die." And there was this chaplain that was there, and was handing out crosses, and he said, "You want to pray?" And I said, "I don't know how to pray." And he goes, "That's okay. God knows how to listen." And so he said, I said, "God, I'm scared." And I had a peace that came over me that I knew that there was something bigger than myself that was out there. here I was a Green Beret, you know, arrogant, self-sufficient, independent, not needing anybody, I thought. But I thought I was going to die. And that was scary for me. And that's when I realized, you know, that prayer, I felt that there was this peace and that there was really a God, and he knew that I was scared, and I felt at peace about it. So I knew that God was real. And from that point on, it took me 2 years, but I went on kind of like a pilgrimage of trying to find out all about that God that I knew now was real. But that's a whole other story. But they did tell me that I almost died, especially from the pneumonia. One of the rounds went through here, and hit my spine. One of the rounds went through here, hit my large intestine. I lost most of my large intestine, lost a lot of the muscle tissue here. I have shrapnel was still in the iliac crest of my pelvis. I had an ileostomy for a year. I remember the funny hospital story is that when I developed a pneumonia, the doctor was saying, you got to cough, you got to cough. I said, what are you talking about coughing? My stomach is split open from here. I got incisions on my stomach from here to here. My intestines are hanging out here in a bag. Because it was my large intestine, it was such a large thing, they didn't have bags big enough. Usually the small colostomy bags, you know, the colostomies are small in the bags, it wouldn't fit over my large intestine because I had a hunk of large intestine that was hanging out. And so they had to jerry-rig some plastic bags that didn't hold all the acid and stuff and the feces and everything when I'd roll over, spilling all over me. And I had my incisions cut open from here to here. They did all kinds of exploratory surgery to heal things up. And he said, you got to cough or else your lungs you're gonna die from this pneumonia. I said, cough, I'm split open, I can't cough. And he goes, you better cough. I'm not coughing. So this guy's next to me. One of the few times that was what got me scared too, is that sometimes I'd wake up when I was unconscious, and I'd wake up and an Australian guy from the Mike Force who was shot in they tried to relieve us. They were dropped in the Mike Force to try to relieve our siege, and they walked right into an ambush. And I watched him die one of those times that I was awake, and I just looked over at him and I saw him going through this chain-stoked breathing, which is this that kind of breathing, and then he just died. And then I would pass out, you know, and then I would come to again, and I'd see somebody else, and they're dying, and then I'd pass out again. And after a while, I just said, man, this is it. If I pass out, I didn't know if I was going to come to or not. But then I developed pneumonia, and I was watching this one guy next to me, and the doctor's telling him, you got to cough, you got to cough. And he's saying, I can't cough, I hurt. So he said, nurse, bring me the surgical tray. So he said, what are you doing? He said, sit still. They held his head. He made an incision right here, took a flexible tube, started shoving it down his throat. And he's going, giving him the cough. I saw that, and I go, I'm coughing. Yeah. That was my 71st evac hospital story about developing the pneumonia. Gee. Some of those things are so vivid, you know, so real. I can still feel them wheeling me into a minor surgery room and digging. Every day they would take me in there to dig more shrapnel out of me. Boy, that was painful.
Do you know how many pieces they pulled out of you?
No. I know there's 14 still in me. I've counted those on x-ray. 14 pieces still in me. And so then I got medevaced to Camp Zama, Japan. And then I, from Camp Zama, got sent to Valley Forge Hospital. I spent 10 months in Valley Forge. And I still had probably a couple of years left in my enlistment because I had re-enlisted. But when I got out of when I got ready to be discharged from Valley Forge, well, when you get there, they say, where do you want to go? I said, okay, my first choice is I want to go back to Vietnam with the 5th. And I remember Sergeant Major Bowser, who was the 5th Sergeant Major, had come up to see me. And I remember asking him, so work it out so that I don't have to leave Vietnam. And I have a letter that he wrote me saying that he really admires my, love for the 5th and stuff and the Montagnards. He said, but it's best to go home where I had the medical care. He said, then come on back. But I remember him coming up to see me. I remember some general coming up and giving me a Silver Star. I remember a few other people, some reporters, and a few other people coming up. Mac came to see me to give me a beret, because my beret, everything had gotten lost out there. And the beret that I still have is the beret that Mac gave me in the hospital. He said, you can't be leaving country with no beret, so he gave me his own. But when I went to Valley Forge, when you get there, I had about 3 or 4 more operations that were there on my back and on my trying to do resections to the large intestine and other internal organs, and then recuperating. Had to go through some physical therapy. But then when they said, okay, now when you're discharged, where do you want to go? And I said, first choice is back to the 5th. Second choice, first in Okinawa, because then I could at least do TDY to Vietnam. Third choice would be the 8th in Panama. You only have 3 choices. So when I finally got discharged, I was expecting to either go to the 5th, the 1st, or the 8th. They sent me to the 10th at Fort Devens. It wasn't even one of my choices. I didn't want to go there. But that's where I ended up, at Fort Devens, which for me was the beginning of the end. It was stateside duty. Didn't want to be there. Wanted to be back in Vietnam. Did not want to play Army. Over there was the real Army. There were the real things going on. Didn't like stateside duty. I was terrible. I was a terrible soldier when I got to Fort Devens with the 10th Special Forces. It was a bad experience for me. Ended up I don't know if I wanted all this in the oral histories, but ended up taking off and going to Montreal. I would not stay away any more than 30 days because I knew that after 30 days they would list you as a deserter. But I would just take off, and then I'd go up to Montreal, and I would just be talking with people, talked to a lot of draft dodgers, deserters up there. I always did things kind of strange, People would often go to Canada before going to Vietnam. I waited until after I got back from Vietnam. Then I went to Canada. But then I ended up coming back, and my team sergeant, Sergeant Castillo, a tremendous, tremendous man, saved my butt so many times because he would cover for me. And also Sergeant Bowers, Glenn Bowers, who was the 10th Special Forces NCOIC of the dispensary. I knew him in Vietnam. He would cover for me because they knew that I was messed up. I was messed up emotionally, psychologically, and physically. And I just, when I got to the 10th, I was there the first day, and they said, okay, report to B Company. You're getting ready to ship out to, we're going to be parachuting into Alaska. Draw your winter gear. I said, I just got out of the hospital, man, and you're telling me I got to parachute into Alaska? I don't think so. So I got in my car and I drove into Boston, waited a couple of days, and I came back and after the guys were all shipped out. And so then I went over, and that's when I found Glenn was there, and I said, Glenn, what can I do? And he said, let me write you a referral to the hospital So he wrote a referral to the hospital. I got examined by the doctors, and they put me on a profile. No prolonged standing, bending, stooping. And they assigned me to headquarters company. And then from headquarters company, they assigned me to work at the dental clinic. So I was a dental assistant to the 10th Special Forces dentist, who was a great guy. First one was a Dr. Overman, and then a Dr. Kostinsik, SF dentists. And they covered for me too. When I didn't show up for work, they never reported me. And I'd be gone. I would just take off for days, weeks. And I'd come back and they'd say, you better go get your mail, it's piling up. They knew that I was just having a real difficult time. And the company commander of headquarters company was a captain. He had worked his way through the ranks. I can't remember his name. I think it was, but he had started out as the EM, and he was a great soldier. But he told me, he said, Gary, if you just cut your hair, shape up a little bit, we'll promote you to E6. I said, I don't want E6. I want to get out. And he would get really angry with me because he said the only time that he would see me is either to chew me out or to hand me another medal, because all these things would come through and I'd be awarded another medal and things. And he would say, if you just shape up, we'll make you an E6, because the only time I see you is just to chew you out or to give you another medal. I said, I don't want E6, I want to get out. So before I had a chance to ruin my military career totally, my stepfather got in touch with our local congressman and told him that, I had served the country and spent my time in Vietnam, spent almost 10 months in the hospital. I wanted to go to medical school, continue with my education, and that I was just being carried as excess in the company. Could I get an early out? And Frank Horton, who was my congressman, went to bat for me and pulled strings, and I got an early out. Even I had 2 years left of my enlistment, but they let me out in time, and I got out August 31st, 1971. Just in time. I got off that day, and I started school at Brockport again, September 3rd, at Brockport. Majoring in pre-med. So to go from the Army to all of a sudden sit in a college classroom, in organic chemistry classes and physiology classes and all that stuff. Wow, what a big shock. But my military career was ended.
When did you receive your congressional?
About 3 years later.
Were you ever aware that you were written up?
No. Didn't even know about it. When I had when I started college, I had $160 in the GI Bill. I had a Volkswagen van. I didn't have a place to stay. I was living in my van. Had C rations and stuff that I was living on. I used to sleep in my van in the PE parking lot. I'd get up in the morning and take a shower in the PE building. And going to school, I used to study in the van. I was not ready for school to go back into that right away. I stayed there for probably till the following semester. I finished one semester there, and I quit again. And I said, because I just couldn't, I wasn't ready. I tried to get a job at Lakeside Memorial Hospital, and with all the medical experience, I thought I could do something pretty good. They hired me, but none of my skills were transferable to civilian life, so I was hired for housekeeping. So I mopped floors. Sorry, I'm back to mopping floors again, And that was just another bad experience. I moved into a commune out in Kent, New York. Out near Albion. Lived in a commune with about 10 other people, and there would be days. I remember writing in my journal, that there was 3 weeks went by once and I never spoke to one person. I was just having real serious difficulties dealing with Vietnam, dealing with the fact that Deo was dead, dealing with the fact that so many people that, all the experiences that I had, I just couldn't sort it all out. So I quit college again. Plus, throughout this whole thing too, I had this knowledge that there was a God, and I wanted to find out more about this God. And so I just went down to New England, and I fell in love with New England, being at Fort Devens. So I had a cousin down there, a guy who actually was a Christian. He talked with me about some of my experiences, asked me if I'd do him a favor and just read Gospel of John. I read through it, and for me, I found that God that I knew was real, and I became a Christian. And I decided that what I needed to do was I wanted to know more about God. That's what I wanted in my life. So and this was in July of 72. And so I went up and went through, there was a small Bible college up in northern New Hampshire called White Mountain Seminary. I started there in September of 73, but I had gone up there for that summer. And one of the things I found out, you ever been up in the White Mountains in New Hampshire? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mount Adams, Mount Washington, it's great. Lancaster, New Hampshire is up past the Notch. It's right on the Connecticut River, the border of St. John's, right across from St. Johnsbury, Vermont. So I started this little Bible college up there. For me, it was trying to get my life together. I knew God had forgiven me, but I still couldn't relate with people. I had a real tough time. My fear was that if people really knew what I was like inside, and if they had seen some of the things that I had done in Vietnam, they'd hate me. So when I was up there, may sound kind of weird, but I actually found this cave in the woods on the north face of Mount Adams. And I lived there. I spent time in the woods. I'd come into town to go to classes, seminary classes, Bible classes, and then I'd go back out into the woods. And I did that for 2 years. But I started that in September 73. But I had a mailbox in town at the post office. So one day when I went in there, I got this little note in my mailbox that said, please be down at the local inn at 6 o'clock tonight. There's going to be a phone call. So I went down to the local inn, had a cup of coffee. 6 o'clock the phone rang. And the guy answered the phone and said, is there Gary Beikirch here? And I said, yep, that's me. He said, the phone's for you. I got on the phone and said, is this the Gary Beikirch that was with the Special Forces? And I said, yep. He said, is this the Gary Beikirch that was at Doc Siang? And I said, yeah, this is me. And he goes, well, my name is Colonel Westmoreland, no relation to the general. But he said, I've been instructed by the President of the United States to let you know that you've been awarded the Medal of Honor. And we'd like you to report down to Washington to receive the medal. Would you like to come? And I had just spent 2 years trying to forget Vietnam. All the other medals, by this time I had the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the DSC, Purple Hearts. And I put all that stuff in my duffel bag because I was trying to forget all that stuff. And all of a sudden this guy's now saying I've been awarded the Medal of Honor, and immediately all that stuff started back up again. And I said, he said, we've had a tough time trying to find you, And he said, we'd like to have you come down. And I said, okay. So they flew a guy up to come and get me. And when he got me, that's how they found me. That's how they found me.
I think I had a sport coach just like that.
Yeah. Well, my mom said, well, because they had contacted her, and she said, well, I think he's somewhere in New Hampshire somewhere. But then when she found out what it was about, she sent me this sport coat. I had to borrow the tie from somebody. It was a clip-on tie, because I was, but that's how they found me. They sent this officer, a captain, Tug Thornberry was his name. He had to fly into Montpelier, rent a car, and drive across Route 2 to come over to Lancaster, and then they picked me up, and he flew me to Washington. And when I got there, they said, we're not going to tell you to cut your hair, but the only thing is that if you choose not to cut your hair, you cannot wear your special forces. You can't wear a uniform. I said, I'm not that attached to my hair. It's no big deal. Cut my hair. You know, SF was too important to me. So I cut my hair, and
Well, we're going to stop. Go do another tape.
okay.
Okay, we're rolling.
So you did get your hair cut?
Got my hair cut. Yep. Came back to Lancaster. The little Coast County Democrat ran a newspaper article. Lancaster Seminarian awarded the Medal of Honor. Medic wants to go back as a missionary. Yeah, I decided I wanted to go back to Vietnam as a missionary. So I was in training to be a missionary when I found out that I was awarded the Medal of Honor. I started the seminary in September of '73, and October of '73, 1 month later, is when they told me that I was awarded the Medal of Honor. And I found out about it with a little note in my mailbox.
Now, you said there were two things in that mailbox that
Yeah.
changed your life.
The other thing that happened was that Lancaster's a very small town, and I think there's not even any street stoplights or traffic lights in the town. But I was taking this correspondence course through New York School of Photography or something, so I was out taking some pictures of Episcopal church in town, which is probably one of the most photographed churches. It's when you always see it when they show New England churches. You know, it's always this St. Paul's Episcopal Church. So I was taking some pictures of it. And my wife says that's the first time that she saw me. But one day I went to the post office box and I get this letter. I opened it up. It's not even mailed or anything. It's just written on a piece of notebook paper and shoved in my mailbox. And it's written from this girl, and she starts just talking about things that's going on and telling me about her life and everything, and I'm thinking, who is this person, And the next, a couple days later, I get another one and then another one, and maybe 3 or 4 of them, and then I get a picture. She puts her picture in there, and very attractive girl. I was probably 27, 28 by this time, and next thing I know, I recognize her because I see her in town. Long story short, and it's really long and involved, but it ended up that my wife had seen me and just wanted to get to know me, so she started writing me these notes. And then one day she saw me in the laundromat down there, so she came down, and when she came in, I recognized her because she'd given me her picture. And so we started talking, and we officially met. It was like on January 1st, and fell in love immediately. March, so January, February, March 30th, we decided, let's get married. She was 19, 19. We knew each other 3 months and got married on March 30th on top of a mountain in New Hampshire. But those were the 2 most important things that I ever received in my life in that little post office box. Being told that I was getting the Medal of Honor, and this note from this woman, young girl who saw me and just wanted to meet me, who eventually became my wife. And we've been married 30 years. But I put her through a lot. After we were married, I went back and I got my undergraduate degree from the University of New Hampshire. I finished the seminary, was ordained, and didn't go back to Vietnam as a missionary because Vietnam fell. I was all ready to go, but then it fell April 30th, 1975. I was ready to go back with Christian Missionary Alliance because they had heard that I had worked with the Sedang, which is the only tribe that they had never been able to have any kind of contact with. And the Sedang were the most warlike and the fierce, the most feared of the Montagnard tribes in the jungles of Vietnam. And they wanted me to go back with them, and I was all set to go back and work with Dr. Bob Green, who had a hospital in Khartoum. But then Vietnam fell, and the NVA overran the hospital and took the people that were in the hospital, and about 4 or 5 of them died as they were being marched back up to the north. So after I finished, I got my degree, and then I finished seminary, was ordained. I went to work and took a job as an associate pastor of a small little church in Lewiston, Maine. Lewiston, actually it was Norway, South Paris. It's right near Lewiston. Pretty little town. But again, I was still having difficulties relating with people. So I moved my wife into this small little hunting camp that we bought, 20 acres of land. I call it a hunting camp, she called it a shack. But we heated with wood, we cooked on a wood stove. We had to haul water from the creek that was in front of our house. You had to go down this dirt road, park your four-wheel drive. You needed a four-wheel drive to get down the dirt road. Park your four-wheel drive and then hike about 200 meters up into the woods. You had to go across this creek, and that's where our house was, up there. Here I am living up there. We had 2 kids at the time. Heating the house with wood, cooking on a wood stove. We didn't even have an outhouse out there. I told my wife that, I said, dig a cat hole, as we used to do in Vietnam. And I'm surprised that she stayed with me through all that. We didn't even have an outhouse. She in the wintertime, she'd have to warm her butt up by this wood stove, run outside, dig a hole in it, and then go to the bathroom, and then come back in. My oldest daughter was probably about 3 or 4 or 5 at the time. She thought it was great. My youngest son was a newborn. He doesn't remember it too much. But my daughter calls it our little house on the prairie time. But my wife often says that the best gift that I ever gave her was one day I finally came home with this collapsible camping toilet that you just pulled out and put a blue bag on. And that was our bathroom facilities. We used to bathe in the creek in the front. And here I was, an associate pastor of a church. We lived there for 2 years. Lived there like that for 2 years. She stayed with me. Because then after we moved from there, and we moved into a teepee, which she liked better than the shack, because the teepee was near a campground and we could add shower facilities there. But shortly after that, I decided that I wasn't doing too well in a ministry kind of thing, but I really loved working with kids. So I decided to come back to New York, and I went back to graduate school and got a master's in counseling, and from that moved into school counseling. But yeah, my wife has been through a lot. She often says that she wished somebody would come and interview her, because she liked to tell them some stories.
Have her come over, we'll do her too, get her side.
She said, Vietnam, nothing compared to what I put her through. But yeah.
I think you've told us how your time in the service affected your life. How do you think winning the Congressional Medal of Honor has affected your life, or do you think it has?
I think for me, I fell in love with the Montagnards. I always say that there's a little motto that I had, that I saw in Vietnam, that was in the Mike Force team house. And it was one of these things, as soon as you read it, it was just emblazoned on my mind. And it said, to really live, you must almost die. To those that fight for it, life has a meaning that the protected will never know. And I almost died. And I think that those experiences in Vietnam really taught me what mattered. To me, life is very, very important now, and it's very, very precious. Vietnam gave me my life mission, and that was just to let people know how important and how precious life is, and to appreciate it, to value it, to treasure it, and to know and believe that there are things worth living for, worth dying for, and worth killing for. Deo taught me that. He died for me. He really did. When I think of, and which is one of the reasons that I decided that I wanted to work with kids, because a 15-year-old gave his life for me. And I think that we as adults too often take young kids for granted. We don't give them enough credit. We think that most of them can't think or feel beyond the next party or something. But I know that kids are capable of valuing something very, very important. And so that's my mission, is to impact kids with that message, that to really live you must almost die. To those who fight for it, life has a meaning the protected will never know. And so that's my mission, is to get that message out. On a more personal level, I also think that because of my hospital experience, that God's an important part of my life. And that I have a chance to tell my story only because of the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor has opened doors. It has allowed me to be able to tell my story to others who would never have heard it if it had not been for the medal. And there's a verse that is very important to me, is Psalm 49, verse 20, that says that man that is in honor and understands not is like a beast that perishes. So it's like God saying, Gary, you're going to be given an honor, but you need to understand something. And if you don't understand it, you're no better than the beast that's going to perish. And what is it that you need to understand? Well, for me, it's God. That God's the most important thing in my life. And I've been given a tremendous honor, but I need to understand that it's for His glory, for His honor, not my own. And so that's the message that I take. So the Medal of Honor has changed my life because it's really helped open the doors and enabled me to have my mission of trying to impact young kids.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actual narrative of the action.
Who are those fellows again?
Paul Landers was the team leader, the captain in charge of the team. Pat DeZinni was the commo man. John Liner was the other commo man. And recently, like within the past couple of years, John Liner ended up coming back or moving to Rochester, New York, and he works for Harris Communications. And he had heard that he remembered that I was from Rochester, and so he's gotten in contact with me. Mm-hmm. And John's writing a book about the whole siege, and so in talking with John, it's helped me to put some order to some of the events that I just remember specific things about. But I never knew the order of those things. For instance, John thought that I had been medevaced like the first day, but I remember things happening that John said didn't happen until the second or third day. So I must have been on site for a couple of days before I was able to be medevaced. So these are the kinds of things that we're learning. But John wants to write a book about the siege at Dock CA. So I know he was involved with, he was one of those that was interviewed. Somebody wrote a book, I can't remember the name of it, but he was a major, George Dooley, and he used to be out in the camp. And I got his book, and I read his recollections of the battle. And in there he writes about putting me in for the Medal of Honor, but I don't remember him being out there. I didn't even know he was there. I thought he had left. So, but I know he was another one whose name is in my files. Like there was somebody that got a hold of all the original recommendations and all the paperwork, and there's just reams of paperwork to go. Has to be gone over before someone is awarded the medal. And his name was in there too as somebody else who was interviewed to ask about the events. It goes through, it's a pretty involved process. Like for me, the action took place April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1970. And I didn't get the medal till October 73. But I think part of that was the fact that I was hiding out and they couldn't find me.
Okay, thank you.
And all my kids and my grandkids. This is a picture of me and my wife. This was at...
No, that wasn't taken in the shack, was it?
No.
That must be the
Even though
teepee.
Even though there's straw there. Now, this was taken at Fort Drum. I was up speaking to the 1st of the 32nd Infantry before they were deployed over to, they went to Afghanistan. And so I do a lot of speaking, and I'm very involved with the ROTC groups and a lot of the people at Fort Drum. And then I also had an opportunity to go back to Vietnam in 1980, and we went to, we actually went back and there's one newspaper article that folds out here. Went back with a delegation to talk with Nguyen Co Tak about the MIA POWs, and we spent some time in Hanoi meeting with the Vietnamese. We went over to start a science council that would be studying the effects of Agent Orange. We wanted to establish an exchange program with Vietnam. Joe Papp he died a few years ago, but he's from the Shakespearean Theater down in New York City. He went over to start a cultural exchange program. We went over to see if we could facilitate the departure of Amerasian children. This was back in '82, and with our delegation, we got there was 9 of us that were vets that went over there, and our government at the time was kind of angry with us for going over because we sidestepped them, and we were invited by the North Vietnamese to come over. They thought we were going to be made political pawns, and once we got over there, the Vietnamese wanted to take us down to the War Crimes Museum and take pictures of us and stuff, and we refused to go. But just as soldiers to soldiers, we wanted to break through and see if we could get some work started on resolving some of these issues. And shortly after that, the orderly departure program for the Amerasian children was started, and we did bring back some remains. But I had that newspaper article, I brought that. I didn't know if you're interested in it. But those are some of the other things that are military related that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with. But yeah, then back in '83 too, as a way of changing the perception of Vietnam vets. Jim Donahue, who's a SF guy he's from Buffalo. He worked for the Department of Labor in Buffalo.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Jim Donahue and Steve Benko.
Mhm.
Yeah, they were very instrumental in getting what we called the Death Valley Marathon team going. We had 13 of us, former SF guys, one Navy SEAL and one UDT guy and one Recon Marine. We parachuted into Death Valley and made a movie of us running across Death Valley. And Martin Sheen did the narration for it. That's another one of my memories that's very, very special. You know, it's one of those things you wanted to do because if you didn't do it, you'd regret it later on when you grew up. I was the youngest guy in the team. I was 36 then. We ran across Death Valley, 110 miles. We'd run 15 miles a day. They made a movie about that. So that was a fun thing. Then I brought there's pictures of the ceremonies and stuff that with Nixon.
So Nixon was, yeah, that's right. 70.
Yeah, Nixon was the one that gave me picture of him giving me the medal. There's Frank Horton.
You think you could hold that up?
Yeah. I don't know if you can get that.
Yeah, that can really zoom in.
I was surprised at how short he was. That's the most memorable thing that I remember about being with Nixon, is thinking, my gosh, you're short. You know? There's another picture of him. But,
Okay, I'd like to, I'll copy that.
Now who is that in the opposite photograph there?
oh, here, this was one of our escort officers, and that's my aunt. And this was another one of the escort officers. See, now again, remember, they got me out of a cave to come down here. And they wanted to wine and dine me, entertain me. They gave my escort officer, he had, let's be with my long hair again before I got it cut. I don't know if I have a picture of him in here, but he was saying, we got $1,500. There's another one of them. He goes, we got $1,500. We want to take you out and party. And I said, I don't want to go anywhere. All the other guys, you know, they're going all out, and they're partying and everything. These were all the Army guys that got the medal with me. One guy refused to get his hair cut, so he had to get it in civilian clothes. He later committed suicide. He was with 101st Airborne. Ken Case was his name. He was an amputee. But these guys they wanted to party, and I said, I don't want to. And so everybody else was out partying and doing the town in Washington. I stayed in my room. I told you, I gave them the money. I said, you guys go out and do it. You go out on your own. They said, man, we can't do that. If we got caught without you, we'd be in serious trouble. I said, well, I'm not going out, guys. But they did finally get me to go out, and they bought me a new outfit, because and they took me to the Watergate restaurant in '73. Went to the Watergate. Yeah.
Right, ironic.
Yes. They had a real big party for me. But when this was over, here I was on the way out, going into the airport, and I flew back to New Hampshire, put all that stuff in my duffel bag, and went back to my cave. And I was just not ready for all that. I put some other pictures in here that these are, yeah. These are pictures of the kids that I took in Vietnam. Some of the kids that were in the camp.
How many of the Montagnards were killed in the siege, do you know?
I don't know. Hundreds. I don't know what the...
Do you know whatever happened to the tribe once Vietnam fell?
They were mostly... I contacted a Christian Missionary Alliance guy, Tom Stebbins, who was in charge of the CMA in Vietnam, and he told me that most of the Sedang were all... the ones that didn't take off into the jungle and were still hiding were put into re-education camps. But that meant for me that they were killed. But most of them always told us that if the Americans ever left, they would just go back into the jungles and still fight. And from what I heard when I went back in '82, the Central Highlands were still a very unsafe area. The Vietnamese were telling us that it was not safe there. There were two areas that were not safe, and they were very concerned about taking us. One was back to the Central Highlands, and the other was in Tay Ninh province near the Cambodian border. They took us up into Tay Ninh, but they had armed guards with us all the time. And boy, that was a rush. I tell you, get off the plane in Hanoi and looking there and seeing these guys with AK-47s and these NVA soldiers. That was scary.
Yeah.
And then, out of everybody that was there, they pulled me in to put me into a separate room in the Hanoi airport and kept me in there for 3 hours. Here I'm thinking, man, they found out I'm Special Forces. They're going to think I'm a CIA spy or something. They're going to take me out and throw me in prison. I have no idea. why they did that. Eventually I was just brought back and no explanation given, but they kept me separate for 3 hours. And just sitting there looking across the desk at an NVA soldier, and he just stared at me for 3 hours with his AK-47. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't need this.
Let me get copies of these, then. Okay.